excluding modern representations of these, what are they historically meant? Stalinism, Maoism, and Trotskyism. Okay, I'll leave that on the screen, Red Maze, and I'll answer you. All right. So what do these terms mean? Well, first of all, there's no such thing as Stalinism. I mean, let me back up. All right. So when Stalin came to power in the Soviet Union, Lenin died. After Lenin's death, Stalin kind of emerged to be the main leader of Soviet communism. And one of the things that Stalin did as he was rising, he didn't really solidify his leadership until 1927. One of the things he did as he was rising is he named the ideology of the Soviet Communist Party as Marxism-Leninism. Right? Originally they called themselves Marxists, and they believed in their practice was called Bolshevism. And he said we're Marxist-Leninists. At the time, in the American Communist Party, there were two factions that were battling each other. One was led by William Z. Foster. The other was led by J. Lovestone. And they were both claiming that they were the Stalinist faction. And Stalin famously said they were both wrong. There is no such thing as Stalinism. And he rejected that. Generally, though, Stalinism is a term. It was Trotsky who started using the term. Trotsky maintained that he was in line with Lenin's teachings and that Stalin had deviated. And he accused the Soviet Union of not being Marxists, but being Stalinists, right? And that's what he called them. And largely because of academia, particularly because of the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the kind of CIA promotion of what they called the anti-Stalinist left. And I mean, that's well documented. The CIA started pouring money into what's called the anti-Stalinist left. That they started referring to countries that were modeled on the Soviet Union. The way the Soviet Union was after the rise of Stalin, after the death of Lenin, after Trotsky was forced into exile, the Soviet Union from like 1928 until its end, and Eastern European governments and North Korea and Cuba and China and Vietnam and governments, that kind of political system that emerged during the Cold War. It's sometimes called really existing socialism. That's one term that's used for it. Sometimes I think in German, they made it all one word, real socialism, right? It's all one word. And the word Stalinism is kind of the more Western derogatory term to refer to the Cold War Marxist-Leninist government model, which Stalin pioneered. And I'm a little bit weird in that I think that, Stalin did in a lot of ways deviate especially from what Marx wanted, but to some degree or other from what Lenin wanted, but that was good. Right. And I think that Stalin was the beginning of communism moving out of Europe, and that Stalin, the political system that Stalin pioneered was it was a mixture of the most radical left-wing ideas of the Bolsheviks and the deeply conservative and traditional ideas of the Russian peasantry. The majority of the people in Russia at the time were peasants who were very religious, were very socially conservative. The Bolsheviks were the most liberal, thinking revolutionary intellectuals or whatever. And Stalin created kind of a synthesis that was both of those things. And that the role that Stalin played in the Soviet Union is he was the czar, right? He was the leader, the public face, the king kind of. And he went around from factory to factory, rewarding people who worked very, very hard. And it was called Stakhanovism. And if you worked really hard, you worked extra hours, he gave you a cash bonus and he gave you a reward and he went and shook your hand. And that Stalin was like you can imagine the Soviet state was like a giant corporation. And Stalin was the CEO, the good boss at the top who goes around encouraging people to work hard, rewarding people, etc. And that there were aspects of Soviet communist culture that emerged really with Stalin that kind of mimicked the Russian Orthodox Church. For example, the pictures of Lenin that were put up everywhere, he has got a halo around his head. He looks like an Orthodox icon. He looks like a saint. And they put Lenin's body in the mausoleum and they preserved his body. And the worship of Lenin that was really invented by Stalin. Stalin invented all of that, had a religious way of doing it. And the Soviet state, Stalin was kind of the role of a king, right? He's the public face of the country who everyone wants to be like, who everyone looks up to, and he gives people rewards. That's kind of like feudalism. But at the same time, women were working in factories alongside men. Women were becoming generals in the army. Women were, women were becoming electrical engineers. So there was gender equality. There was daycare. So because women were working in the factories, they had daycare provided for the kids. Fast food. A lot of people say the American fast food, McDonald's and all of that, was really inspired by the Soviet Union because women couldn't be home cooking all day. They had collective kitchens where on your way home from the factory, you would pick up your food. Fast food, people say a lot of that was inspired by the Soviet model that developed, and that the Soviet Union, women have equality with men. Women are in the military. Women are working in factories. Women are voting. Women are political leaders of the party, etc. But at the same time, Stalin, he outlawed homosexuality. He outlawed abortion. Right? Abortion had been legalized by the Bolsheviks, but Stalin outlawed abortion. And they really glorified what they called the Soviet family, which was a father and a mother and children. And women were given medals if they had more than 10 children. One of the highest medals you could get was Mother of the Soviet Union. So what Western academia calls Stalinism is this model of a one-party state where you have a charismatic leader at the top who is encouraging everyone to work really, really hard, and is presiding over industrialization. And Stalinism, if you want to call it that, it's not really a good term. Stalinism is a very, very, very effective way of taking a country that is underdeveloped, that is not industrialized, and electrifying the whole country and wiping out illiteracy and paving the roads and bringing everybody running water and industrializing and bringing modern industry to a country. And that's what Stalinism is very good at. And it did it in the Soviet Union, and it did it in China, and it did it in North Korea, and it did it in Vietnam. And many countries have modernized with Stalinism. And I would say that Stalinism, it wasn't just Marxist-Leninist countries. Ba'athist Arab socialism in Syria and Iraq, and Arab socialism in Egypt with Abdel Nasser, Gaddafi's Libya. These countries were basically that system. Right? They were one-party states. They had a very charismatic leader at the top. They mobilized the population to go and build the power plants, pave the roads, wipe out illiteracy. The problem with quote-unquote Stalinism is that after you get over that first hurdle of industrialization, after you've paved the roads and electrified the country, built modern universities, then it kind of stagnates. And the reason it stagnates is because everything is government-owned. Everything is government-run. And that's when you need Deng Xiaoping, and you need, private enterprise. You need people to, for the things that make life fun, right? The government is great at running a power plant, right? If you have a power plant, you have people who work at the power plant. They show up at a certain time every day. They get a paycheck. After they're there for a few years, they get a raise. After they're there for a few more years, they get a raise. It works great. And a steel mill works great, right? Government steel mill, you work there, and you show up on time every day. You do your job. You produce the right amount of steel. You're there for a few years. You get a raise. It works great, right? The government is great at running steel mills. Government is great at running power plants. Government is great at running healthcare, right? I mean, hey, the doctor is there. People walk in and get their care. Doctor gets his paycheck. People get their care. The government can run a lot of things. And this notion that you can't have a government-run industry, that's bullshit. The place where government is weak is the places where it's not necessities of life, right? It's not, electricity. It's not healthcare. It's things that make life fun, right? Government bureaucrats shouldn't be deciding what clothes we wear. We want to pick clothes based on what we think looks really cool. And we need to be able to vote with our dollars on what clothes are good. And those who make the clothes should be incentivized to make clothes that we really want to buy, right? Clothing, which is a consumer good, it's better if that's done by a private company. And the same for children's toys. The same for a lot of things. That there are a lot of things that the market can do, but they're not things that should be dominant, right? There are certain things you have to have as a country. You have to have a medical system. You have to have electricity. You have to have steel. You have to have mining. And those things, the state can run them. But for things that are not necessities, but things that just make life pleasurable, right? I think the market can be very good for. And Stalinism, the Stalinist model, doesn't really have room for that. In the Stalinist model, you have like 91% state ownership. So, but Stalinism when it really gets down to it, it's referring to Marxism, Leninism, and it's really something that Western academics use to refer to a specific political and economic system that was very prominent during the Cold War and did amazing things and lifted millions of people out of poverty, invented space travel, invented the mobile phone, right? The first mobile phone in history was invented by Leonid Kaprianovich in the Soviet Union. You know, I mean, the idea that Stalinism or socialism failed, I mean, that's just not true, right? These countries wiped out illiteracy, created modern healthcare systems. Look, you know, I mean, some of the statistics around these things are absolutely crazy. There's one statistic. I was doing research about the number of universities in the USSR, and I wanted to get the number right. And so I investigated when I was working on the Khrushchevism book, and I how many colleges did the USSR have before Stalin, and how many did they have as a result of Stalin? And this is the number, right? Between 1927 and 1953, the number of higher education institutions in the Soviet Union, that's universities, trade schools, and institutes, went from 91 to 800. So before Stalinism, the Soviet Union had 91 colleges. After Stalinism, they had 800. Okay, now how is that a failed system? If a country goes from 91 colleges to 800 colleges, like that's huge, right? And I mean, they electrified the whole country. They paved all the roads. They provided modern housing with running water and electricity to everybody. I mean, it's like none of that counts for anything, right? None of that matters, right, Caleb? Well, no, there was a famine in Ukraine in 1931, so none of that counts. Oh, whoopsie daisy. I mean, it's just the way they talk about Soviet history. It's like they show a slide of a famine and say, see, everyone starved to death. And it's like, no, a whole country was modernized and it was built up so strong that it could defeat the Nazis and then rebuild itself again. I mean, the achievements are massive, right? These are countries that were kept in chronic poverty that built themselves up. So, when you're talking about what is Stalinism, I'm telling you in a roundabout way, what Stalinism is it's not really a thing, right? But it's a label that Western academia has put onto a certain stage of anti-imperialist development, a certain stage of countries that have broken out of Western capitalism and started building themselves up in a certain way and been very successful. But at a certain point, they have to transcend it, which China has done, Vietnam has done, and anti-imperialist countries have largely done in our time. Anti-imperialist countries in our time are not rebuilding the Soviet model, right? They have market sectors, they have micro entrepreneurship programs, etc. Vietnam and China have done this. North Korea and Cuba would like to be more like North Korea or more like Vietnam and China. And that modern 21st century socialism involves a market sector, but there you go. So that's Stalinism. Maoism. Mao Zedong was the leader of the Chinese Revolution. Prior to leading the Chinese Revolution, Mao was an anarchist. He was a follower of Peter Kropotkin. A lot of people don't know that, but he was a university librarian. He had been a high school principal, right? Which a lot of people don't know that. But the first essay Mao ever wrote was about physical education and why it's important to have exercise in school. And Mao was a high school principal who taught high school kids, and he had his own anarchist group. It was called the New People's Study Society. And they were anarchists in that they wanted to empower the peasantry, and they were against, landlords oppressing peasants, but they were really Chinese nationalists, because what his group did is they boycotted Japanese goods. And it was this anarchist group led by a high school principal that, when there was kind of an upsurge of Chinese nationalism, the May 4th movement, it was called, in 1919, after World War I, a lot of China had been seized by Germany, or had been seized by countries that lost the war, and China was not given its territories back, right? And Japan was allowed to antagonize and oppress China. And so Mao and his organization, which was hundreds of people, went around boycotting Japanese goods and burning stores that sold Japanese products. And they were fighting for China's national dignity. China was a country that had been degraded and humiliated And they were fighting for China's national dignity. Oh, yeah. Well, Red Maze is thanking me for my answer, but I'm not done yet. We're only on Maoism, so we'll keep going. And it was this organization that Mao had formed, and Mao had grown up in the countryside in a wealthy family. His family were landowners, but he grew up in the countryside. He was a rural guy, and he had this group of students who boycotted Japanese goods and studied Peter Kropotkin and anarchism, and they existed. And then when the Russian Revolution happened, all of a sudden you had the Soviet Union was this new government that was communist, and Mao and his group merged into the Chinese Communist Party. There's a great movie you can watch about the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. In the West, they released it called the Beginning of the Great Revival. I think in Chinese, it's called The Founding of the Party. It's a great movie. Throughout the movie, Mao is walking around, and they ask Mao, they say, hey, Mao, like, isn't this Bolshevism, isn't this a Russian thing? And he says, no, Bolshevik just means majority. And in China, the workers and the peasants are the majority. And they repeat that line, and that Marxism, Leninism, or communism was this new idea from Russia, and that Marxism had not been very popular in China prior to the Russian Revolution. There were a lot of radicals in China. There were a lot of revolutionaries and stuff, but they weren't Marxist, because Marxism is about the labor movement. It's about the industrial worker. And there was very little industry in China, right? There were railroad workers that went on strike. There were some factories here and there, but it was largely an agrarian country. So communism, Marx's writing is all about the factory worker fighting the employer, and people weren't reading that. But then when the Soviet Union had its revolution, communism was this new exciting thing, and the New People's Study Society of China merged into it. It was this group led by Mao. And Mao had a particular attachment to adolescence, which is very interesting. The first interview that Mao ever gave was to American journalist Edgar Snow, and he spends a lot of that interview talking about fighting with his father when he was a teenager. And that Mao had a particular relationship with adolescence, and China, a Confucian society, that the traditional family, filial piety is a really big thing. And so kind of the anger of Chinese teenagers is very big. One of Mao's first followers when he formed the New People's Study Society was a woman who was going to be forced into an arranged marriage to a husband she didn't love. And so she ran away from home, and she ended up joining Mao's New People's Study Society. And that Mao, he had kind of this group of people that followed him, and they boycotted Japanese goods and engaged in activism. They merged into the Chinese Communist Party. Mao was not popular in the early years of the Chinese Communist Party. He was seen as kind of an obscure figure. And 1927, Mao wrote a very, very important essay called Report on an Investigation of the Peasant Uprisings in Hunan, because Mao was from the countryside. He was from Hunan. And in Hunan, the peasants had rose up against the landlords, and they were killing their landlords. So Mao went there, and he observed it, and he said, this is where the energy is. And it's one of Mao's most poetic essays. There's a lot of quotes that come out of that essay. He said, a single spark can light a prairie fire. He said, revolution is not a dinner party. It cannot be so refined and magnanimous. It's an act of violence by which one class overthrows another. And he's basically writing, and he's saying that this peasant movement, this peasant uprising in Hunan, these peasants rising up and killing the landlords, redistributing the land. He said, this is the future. And if we want to build a communist movement in China, this is where we need to go. And nobody listened to him. And he's calling out his own party, because his own party, he's saying, you guys are focused in the cities. The energy is in the countryside. The revolution in China is going to come from the rural areas. It's the rural poor people who are going to make the revolution. And Mao saying that was not a popular thing. But, what happened? Well, the Chinese Communist Party grew very significantly in the 1920s because the Soviet Union was providing military training to the Chinese government, right? You had the Republic of China at the time, led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And even though it wasn't a communist government, the Soviet Union was providing military training. They sponsored a military training school in China, and they provided weaponry. And so there was a lot of people in the Chinese government and military that were heavily influenced by the Soviet Union. After Dr. Sun Yat-sen died, Chiang Kai-shek, who came to power, he started very heavily suppressing the communists. And so there was a big, huge crackdown on communists. Over 100,000 communists were executed. and they had to flee to the countryside. If you were in the city and you were a communist, you got killed. And when they fled to the countryside, they formed an army. And it was the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese army. And Mao was the leader of the People's Liberation Army. Many times they tried to fire Mao as the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. The Communist International liked other people. There were other people that Moscow liked, but Mao was the leader of the organization. He was the general. He was a military guy who was leading the military in the countryside that was carving out liberated territory and organizing the peasantry. And Mao, he took Soviet ideology and he said, okay, we're going to organize the peasants rather than the industrial workers. And, and he built this kind of, and in a lot of ways, Mao was, Peter Kropotkin was the anarchist Mao had followed. And Peter Kropotkin had built a peasant movement. And Mao was kind of still a Kropotkinist. He, was still building a peasant movement. And he built a peasant army. And Mao was a brilliant mass organizer. And Chinese communism, I'm getting to the answer what Maoism is. Chinese communism always had its own following, right? There was an American journalist named Agnes Smedley, an American feminist. And she moved to China and she started writing books about the Red Army and how amazing it was. And that Edgar Snow, an American journalist from Missouri, went to China and he interviewed Mao and he wrote this book, Red Star Over China, that was a bestseller. And that even though Chinese communism was part of this global brand called communism, it always had its own way of doing things. And it was much more religious. This is one thing that it's weird. They were atheist, dialectical materialists, but people always said that Mao's appeal was much more spiritual. It was like, do the right thing. They had, criticism, self-criticism. And you were like, you would wrangle, are you doing the right thing or not? You had struggle sessions where it was like, learning to do the right thing, arguing about your behavior. Are you doing right? Where people got up and confessed when they did something wrong. It was like a confession ritual. And that people compared the liberated territories in China when Mao was waging his war, they compared it to early Christianity. You basically gave up all your possessions and you lived with a group of other people and you sang songs 24 hours a day. And they took all the traditional Chinese songs and rewrote them to have communist lyrics. And you sang songs 24 hours a day and you had no possessions and you were building an army and building a communist movement. And they were very strict in opposing corruption, which is interesting because there was a whole history of corruption in China and that there were many of these rural villages when the Red Army arrived, the people panicked because anytime an army showed up, it was to rape and pillage and kill them all and steal their stuff. And when the Red Army showed up and didn't rape and pillage and steal all their stuff, they were like, damn, this is something special. And they joined it. And that was what was special. Chiang Kai-shek's armies and the various armies in China's history were known they would just rob any village they came to. And the Chinese Communist Army didn't do that. How did they prevent that from happening? With the death penalty. And they used the death penalty very liberally. And if you stole anything from the village that you went to, they put you up against the wall and shot you. And they used very rigid authoritarian military discipline to prevent corruption. And that won over the population. They would not allow any corruption, among their military. And that won the loyalty of the population in a way that other forces in the country hadn't done. And that was, again, it was this emphasis on morality, on doing the right thing, right? This was a big part of Mao's approach, and that Mao Zedong was a mass organizer. He was very Chinese, right? And again, this is not something we can relate to. We are not in China. We did not grow up in a Confucian society. We can't relate to this, right? This is a very different society. And this was, the country that China was before the communists came to power, the amount of poverty that was there, we can't even imagine. It was extreme poverty. One thing that was, this is just heartbreaking, but Shanghai, right, which is a port city in southern China. Shanghai at the time was the prostitution capital of the world. There were more prostitution houses there, and it was mainly children, women, girls that were underage. And it was people from all over the world went there to have sex with little girls. It's awful. It's horrible what was going on. And that in Western media, Chinese people were routinely demonized as heartless people because look how many of them have sold their children into child prostitution, right? And that Shanghai was this place that people from all over the world went, and it was just this child prostitution hub. Well, what was the reality was that millions of people were starving to death, and that in a situation where a child might starve to death, selling a child into prostitution made sure they had food, right? And that was never factored in. But like every day, and like this is what drives me crazy when people say Mao starved millions of people. Mao started the process of China lifting millions of people out of poverty. Millions of people were already starving in China. Every year, people died of starvation in China. Over and over again, there were famines in China that killed millions of people all the time. And Mao is the one who brought tractors to China. They called them iron oxen. And Mao is the guy who, brought the first power plants to China. Millions of people in China never would have seen a doctor if Mao hadn't organized the barefoot doctor program. All kinds of doctors were sent to rural areas. Like, you have no idea how poor China was before the communists took power, right? And again, like the stuff about Shanghai and the child prostitution, and it's like this was a country that was devastated. Edgar Snow talks about, in 1927, before the communists took power, there was a famine in China that killed millions of people. And that famine, because you can't blame communism for it. It has like 3 sentences about it on Wikipedia because it's not helpful in demonizing communism. That's before the communists came to power. But Edgar Snow was living in China when that famine happened. And he said, look, there were regions with plenty of food. And then there were regions where there was no food. And there was no strong central government that could organize bringing food to the areas that didn't have it. And people died not because there was not enough food, but because they didn't have central government to organize it. That was the crazy thing, is that there were parts of China that had food, but they couldn't get the food to the rural areas. There was no strong central government to do it. And that's, again, when you talk about one China, why is China so obsessed with Taiwan? Why is China so offended by Uyghur separatism, Tibet separatism, Hong Kong separatism? It's because of the fact that part of the way they were kept poor was they were divided. They didn't have a strong central government. Now they do. The Chinese Communist Party is the strong central government that if they have a famine in one region, the Chinese Communist Party will take food from the other region and get it there. They don't have these kind of problems. But the amount of poverty before Mao came to power was so extreme, right? It was so extreme. And so we can't relate. Mao Zedong thought, the Chinese Communist Party basically said, we believe in Marxism, Leninism as our ideology. But then on top of our Marxist-Leninist ideology, we have Mao Zedong thought, right? Maoism is not a term that's used in China. That's a term that was used later. Maoist was a term that people used to describe people that were aligned with China and all of that. But in China, the term was Mao Zedong thought, MZT, Mao Zedong thought. And that's still to this day the Chinese Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist ideology, Mao Zedong thought. And now, in addition to Mao Zedong thought, they have what's called Deng Xiaoping theory. And Deng Xiaoping theory, it's like, you have ideology, Marxism, Leninism, you have Mao Zedong thought, which is an application of Marxist-Leninist ideology to specific Chinese conditions. And then Deng Xiaoping theory is a focus on development, utilizing the market, etc. So Maoism generally refers to the unique approach that Mao Zedong had to the Chinese Revolution, which is Chinese. It is very Chinese. It is not Western. And it's one of these things I was talking about, the Nation of Islam. We can't relate to it. It's not for us to understand, right? It's very Chinese, but it's very, very effective. And it does not, right? It does not do that. So yeah, there you go. And then Trotskyism. Trotsky was somebody. He was a Marxist leader from Russia, who I've talked a lot about him before. But Trotsky was he was an intellectual of Russian origin, a well-known writer and speaker about Marxism from Russia, who spent most of his life in exile. And he joined the Bolsheviks at the last minute in July of 1917 when they were on the verge of taking power. And he really just didn't agree with Lenin. Lenin said that the fight isn't against capitalism, it's against imperialism, that the revolutionary energy will come from the East and the developing countries rather than the capitalist West. It'll be nations fighting for their national liberation that will bring socialism into the world. Trotsky had his theory of permanent revolution, which was that basically the only point of the Soviet Union was to spread communism to where it really matters, which is the West, right? And that he held on to the classical Marxist conception that, socialism will come into the world by the factory worker in the Western country seizing his factory, right? And it's going to be the Western capitalist countries that are the most advanced that will eventually have communism. Lenin repudiated that. Lenin said it's the countries that are kept poor by the domination of Western capitalism that will break free from Western capitalism and imperialism, and they will, use socialism to build themselves up. That's the basis of the revolution. Trotsky never accepted that. He was a classical Marxist, and he was a self-hating Russian. Trotsky was a Jew who was a victim of anti-Semitism, and he hated the Russian peasantry, thought they were backward. His disagreement with Lenin was that Lenin called for building, the government that he called for was what he called a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and peasants. And Trotsky said, no, only the workers, right? The peasants are an inherently backward class. He hated peasants. He believed peasants were an inherently backward class because they want to own their own land. They want to become capitalists or small farmers. That peasants are inherently backward. Trotsky also went around calling for the United States of Europe. He wanted all the European countries to merge into the European Union. And Lenin said, we don't want that. We want the European countries to be divided because if they're united, they can more effectively colonize the third world. But Trotsky did not have, Leninism has this fundamental belief that the Western imperialist financial monopolies, capitalism in its monopolistic stage, the domination of the world by Wall Street and London is the main problem. That's Leninism. That's Lenin saying, okay, yeah, Marx understood about the factory worker and the factory owner and all of that, but actually we're in this stage where it's big bankers dominating the world. That's what we're against. And that factory owners and capitalists who are fighting against that system are useful allies. And that ultimately the working class has the most to gain from defeating imperialism, but we're fighting imperialism. We're not fighting capitalism. We're fighting imperialism, which is the monopolistic capitalism of our age. And capitalists can be useful allies. And in China, they had the block of four great classes: the workers, the peasants, the the urban merchants, and the national capitalists. And that, in Russia, it was the revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and peasants. And that, that the various communist revolutions that have happened, there have been capitalists that have been aligned with them. Because it's about defeating imperialism. It's about polarizing against the imperialists, mobilizing the nation against imperialism. That's what the fight is. But Trotsky doesn't think that. And Trotsky very much believes it's about the workers, the factory workers and the factory owners, the workers and the bosses. And it's the West that's where it's at. And that these third world revolutionary movements, they don't really matter that much. At the end of the day, it's all just about spreading communism to the Western countries. That's Trotskyism. Trotsky, the Soviet Union didn't believe that. Stalin said, we're going to build socialism in one country. And so Trotsky fled the Soviet Union and he built his own movement in the late 1930s. That was, I guess it was the whole 1930s, but it really escalated in the late 1930s. That was a movement that said, we're communists. We love Lenin. We love Marx. And we're inspired by the Russian Revolution, but we hate Stalin. We hate the Soviet government. And that movement that they created, it was like a counter gang. It basically, Trotsky in his final years of life, he was a professional anti-communist. He had been part of the Russian Revolution. He'd been a witness. He'd been a leader of the Russian military. So he very much, had the credibility, and he was against Stalin. So he was put up on the stage. Here's a real live Bolshevik. Here's a guy who had led the Red Army. And he said Stalin's a phony and a fraud and a sellout. And Trotskyism, was boosted by Western intelligence, most especially during the 1950s and the Cold War, but earlier it was. And that, there was a very similar movement in Nazi Germany. There was what was called Strasserism, right? One of the founders of the Nazi Party was Gregor Strasser and his brother Otto Strasser. And they were Nazis, right? And they were part of the Nazi Party, and they were leaders of the stormtroopers and all of that. And then when Hitler came to power, he had the Night of the Long Knives, and he executed Gregor Strasser. So Gregor Strasser's brother, Otto Strasser, fled to Britain, and he had a radio show in Britain, and he broadcasted from Britain, I'm the true Nazi, and Hitler sold out, and Hitler's a phony, Hitler's a fraud, he's abandoned Nazism, right? And that Trotskyism was largely that. It was, that making effective propaganda doesn't just mean that you you just demonize the ideology. You find somebody who agrees with your enemy's ideology but says that the leaders are phonies. And that's what Trotskyism was, right? There were a lot of people in Russia who maybe they were sympathetic to communism. They didn't like Stalin. So then they invent Trotsky, who says, well, I'm a communist too, but that Stalin guy is bad. It served a propaganda purpose. Many people believe, and Trotsky was convicted of collaborating with Germany and Japan to try and pull off a coup against Stalin, that he had made some kind of deal with Germany and Japan, and that he and Bukharin and Zinoviev were going to, take the Soviet military, overthrow Stalin, and then they would give a bunch of territory of the Soviet Union to Nazi Germany, and then they would keep a chunk of it for themselves. Now, I don't know if Trotsky really did that. That's what he was convicted of. Zinoviev and Bukharin confessed. People say they confessed under torture. I don't know if that's really true. Okay, I really don't know. What I do know is that Nazis were promoting Trotsky as an anti-Soviet propaganda mechanism. I know that because that is admitted, and Joseph Goebbels' diary admits that, and that during the Spanish Civil War, General Franco admits that he was boosting what he called the fifth column in Barcelona, which was the PUM, which was the Trotskyite organization in Spain, and that that Trotsky, whether he knew it or not, he was being boosted by fascists against the Soviet Union because he'd had a falling out with the Soviet Union, and that's why Trotsky was killed right as World War II was breaking out. That basically, Stalin feared that Trotsky would be used to mobilize communists against World War II, and that they needed as much global support. The Soviet Union needed as much global support as possible. And Trotsky was putting out an anti-war message at the time of his death when World War II began. He was putting out a plague on both your houses. When France was invaded by Nazi Germany, he condemned the French communists for trying to defend the homeland from the Nazi invaders. And Trotsky was basically putting out a position of plague on both your houses in World War II. And, Trotskyites in America were were trying to infiltrate the U.S. Army and form a union of soldiers to disrupt the war effort and all that. And Trotsky said, no. At that point, Stalin killed Trotsky because, now whether Trotsky had indeed, consciously joined this conspiracy with the Nazis or whatever, I have not seen conclusive proof of that. Dr. Grover Furr makes a very persuasive case that is the case, but I don't know. What I do know is that Trotsky and his ideas were boosted first by fascists, and then after World War II, Trotsky was dead at that point, by the CIA. The Congress for Cultural Freedom program of the CIA hired Irving Kristol, who was a Trotskyist, to run it, and they hired a bunch of Shachtmanites like Irving Howe, and Mary McCarthy and others. They hired them to run their fake leftism, their CIA leftism, and that Trotskyites are always on the side of the American government, right? And that's something that they pointed out, right? And that among Trotskyites, there are three general types of Trotskyists, okay? First, you have what are called third camp Trotskyists. And these are people who actually broke with Trotsky. In his final years of his life, right before he died, as World War II was breaking out, you had the non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So the Pact of 39. And when the Pact of 1939 was signed, there were a number of Trotskyites who said the Soviet Union was no longer socialist. It was a deformed workers' state. It was state capitalism. It was, it had all been overturned. And those people had a falling out with Trotsky in his final years. They were the third camp Trotskyites. The leader of them in the United States and in New York City was a guy named Max Shachtman, James Burnham, Martin Aburn, and they broke with Trotsky in 1939 over the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And they were the New York intellectuals. And they are the ones who eventually became neocons. Was these Trotskyists who broke with Trotsky because they completely turned against the Soviet Union. And third camp Trotskyism says that the Soviet Union and Cuba and China and all the communist countries are not socialist, and they are just as bad, if not worse, than the capitalist West, right? And the third camp Trotskyism is CIA. It is completely CIA, and it always has been. Like Irving Kristol, the founder of the Congress for Cultural Freedom program, was a Shachtman follower. Irving Howe, who was the leader and one of the founders of DSA, was promoted by the CIA and was one of these people. And for a long time, the biggest third camp Trotskyist organization in America was called the ISO, the International Socialist Organization. And they have a nonprofit called Haymarket Books. It's like a publishing company. It's still around, but from like the 80s, early 80s up until until 2019 when they liquidated, the ISO, the International Socialist Organization, they were on every college campus. They were the most visible communist socialist group in America, and they're a third camp Trotskyite group. They disavowed and denounced every communist government. They invoked Trotsky, but when it really got down to it, they didn't agree with Trotsky because Trotsky said the Soviet Union was a deformed workers' state. They just had no love for it, and it's a CIA thing. And that Haymarket Books, this nonprofit, and 2019 they dissolved into DSA. There was a sexual scandal or something, and they just dissolved into DSA. And it's all the same people, and they're all still being paid by the nonprofit, by Haymarket Books. They just don't have ISO anymore. They now they're Haymarket Books. Now they're just part of the Democratic Socialists of America. But they were the main third camp Trotskyist group. There's others. There's other third camp Trotskyist groups, and they're mainly on college campuses. They're mainly academic, and they disavow all communist and socialist countries. And they're just college professors, writers who talk about communism. Right. So there's that. Then you have what's called mainline Trotskyism. And that's when Trotsky, built a group called the Fourth International. That's what he called it. The Communist International was the Third International. So he formed his own Third International or Fourth International. The common term is the Third International. Trotsky formed the Fourth International. And the Fourth International was Trotsky's group. And after Trotsky died, it was led by largely the main intellectual associated with them was a guy named Ernest Mandel. And it was the Fourth International, the Socialist Workers' Party in America. It was, and that mainline Trotskyism says that the Soviet Union was a workers' state, but it was a deformed workers' state. And it said, Cuba was a workers' state, but it was, and it basically, they support socialist countries, but not really. They say they're socialist in form, but they're led by a parasitical Stalinist bureaucracy. And they also they really opposed the Vietnam War, and they had support for Ho Chi Minh because they thought he was a third world revolutionary. At different times, they liked Fidel Castro, but for the most part, they're against communist governments, but they are also like, they support third world national liberation movements while opposing the Soviet Union. And that's called mainline Trotskyism. And they tend to emphasize labor unions, right? And in Britain, mainline Trotskyism had a lot of power. During the 1980s, Manchester, which is a major city in Britain, their city council was run by mainline Trotskyists. The Labor Party was infiltrated by what was called the militant tendency, which was mainline Trotskyists, and they ran the city council. And to this day, I mean, in Britain, there's Trotskyist groups that join the Labor Party and try to infiltrate it. And there's groups like Socialist Alternative that, again, they kind of support socialist countries, but not really. They want to form labor unions and stuff. And that's mainline Trotskyism. Mainline Trotskyism also had CIA support, not as much as third camp Trotskyism. Mainline Trotskyism, the main smoking gun that I found is that there's a guy named Leslie Evans, who was a leader of the Socialist Workers' Party, and he wrote an autobiography, which I have on the shelf over there, called Outsider's Reverie. And it's just his autobiography about what it was like to be in the Socialist Workers' Party in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And he admits that when he was a leader of the Socialist Workers' Party, the Rand Corporation, which is a nonprofit run by the CIA, provided him with free housing for years. He didn't have to pay any rent, no rent, no mortgage. He lived in a house that was given to him by the Rand Corporation. Now, I mean, if the leaders of a communist group are basically, having their housing given to them for free by the CIA, by a CIA-run corporation, that rings some alarm bells of covert support. And he also talked about they were heavily involved in running anti-nuclear rallies in the 1980s, and that there were Pentagon military people who were like working with them, and that they even provided them with office space at one point, right? That, you know, that some Pentagon guy said, oh, I really agree with you guys, and gave them office space, you know, to run their anti-nuclear weapons and anti-nuclear power rallies and stuff like that. And you read that and it's like they were being backed by the American government covertly, because it was about creating distance between the Soviet Union and the countries in the third world fighting for liberation. In particular, Cuba, right? They were trying to separate Cuba from the Soviet Union. They were trying to separate the Vietnamese national liberation struggle from the Soviet Union that was funding it. And then especially in the late Cold War, in the late 70s, the USA started arming various anti-Soviet groups. Like in Afghanistan, they were arming Osama bin Laden to fight against the Soviet Union. Well, the Trotskyites all loved that. They said, oh, the Afghan people are fighting the Stalinist invaders, and they cheered for that. You know, well, I mean, if you want to give credibility to a group of the third world that are fighting the Soviet Union, one way to do it is to find a group of communists who will support them. And so the SWP and the Fourth International, yeah, they supported Osama bin Laden, the freedom fighters of Afghanistan. And wherever the CIA was funding some kind of rebel group that was fighting against communists, the Trotskyites gave it cover. Right. And they, you know, and they might be sympathetic to Cuba. They were sympathetic to Algeria, which is weird. But for a while, Algeria, I guess Ben Bella was a leader of Algeria who was kind of a communist. And they were, for a while, Ben Bella was kind of funding, you know, and Trotskyites were going to Algeria. And that Trotskyites, it was like whenever there was a communist government or a communist government, they were trying to pull away from the Soviet Union, the Trotskyites would show up and make friends with them. Whenever there was kind of an armed uprising against the Soviet Union, the Trotskyites would support it in the name of, well, you got to support it because the Soviet Union and communism is so bad. And they played a confusion role. And that's mainline Trotskyism. This U.S. Socialist Workers Party, what do you call them? The militant tendency in Britain, the Fourth International, you know, various groups. Now there's one weird outlier, right? So in addition, you have the third camp Trotskyites, and then you have the mainline Trotskyites. There's one other group, which I actually find to be very interesting. I'll be honest with you. Very interesting. They're a little strange, but I find them to be much more honest and sincere. And those are people that you call Orthodox Trotskyists. And they're a wing of Trotskyism that you know, it's various Trotskyist groups that they kind of live in their own world. They follow Trotsky in almost a religious, loyal way. For example, they maintain World War II is still happening. Why? Well, Trotsky said at the time he died, the only way World War II will end is with a workers' revolution. And there hasn't been a workers' revolution. So clearly World War II must still be going on. That's a little crazy. It's a little kooky, you know, but that's what they think. The Spartacist League is probably the most famous of these groups. It's an American Trotskyist group, the Spartacist League, and they are Orthodox Trotskyists. They're ultra Trotskyists, and they spent Orthodox Trotskyists spend a lot of time talking about other Orthodox Trotskyists. They go over each other's manifestos line by line, looking for a deviation, and they tend to take positions that no other group will take as a way of proving they're the most revolutionary. But to their credit, they're much more consistently anti-imperialist, right? Orthodox Trotskyists, because they read Lenin for word, they read Trotsky word for word. A lot of them, you know, they supported, you know, Crimea joining with Russia, and they defend Russia and Ukraine because they understand Western imperialism is the main enemy. You know, a lot of them, you know, they opposed the U.S. government bombing Libya, and they don't support CIA-led uprisings, and they will not support officially people that are fighting U.S. imperialism around the world. But if the U.S. imperialists are attacking a country, they'll announce, they call for military support. You know, they wanted military support of Iraq against the U.S. invaders, right? Military support of Libya and military support for Gaddafi. And that they, because they're so intensely ideological, right? They will take good positions sometimes. And I've never seen evidence of the CIA supporting them. Because they tend to be very small groups, and there's not many of them left. It used to be the first time I ever went to anti-war protests when I was like a teenager, you'd go to an anti-war protest and there'd be, you know, all kinds of these little Orthodox Trotskyist groups, the League for the Revolutionary Party, and the International Bolshevik Tendency. and the Spartacist League and the International Workers League, and there was a million of these little groups, and they were very angry, and if they knew you were with another communist group, they would shout at you. And there was a kind of autistic personality they would attract, right? People that were very, very bookish and got very caught up in the disagreements between the different groups, right? And it was a group. They would kind of attract very kind of really bookish and nerdy guys, and they would fight for their party. Their party was the one true party, right? And they were very caught up in fighting with the other parties, and you don't see them anymore. Largely because of the fact that now there's the internet. Now guys like that just get on the internet and they edit Wikipedia and they fight with other people. They don't join one of these groups. It used to be if you were a young man who was really interested in communism, you would join one of these groups. And now if you're kind of a semi-autistic young man and get really into communism, you just get on the internet and argue with people. You don't have to join one of these groups, but you used to have to join one of these groups. And so there were a lot of these groups, and there would be kind of weird semi-autistic guys who were very angry, usually very, very angry. And they would scream at each other and they would fight with the other communist groups. They would go to the other groups would have meetings and they would go to the groups' meetings and debate them. And Orthodox Trotskyism is a weird outlier. And, occasionally there's an Orthodox Trotskyist group that does good things. For example, World Socialist Website. They don't agree with me on a lot, but they actually have done some really good stuff around Julian Assange and other things because they're at odds with U.S. imperialism. They're an Orthodox Trotskyite group, and they do some good stuff. They're a bit sectarian. They've dissed Jimmy Dore and some others, but whatever. And Jerry Healy, in my book on Khrushchevism, I have a chapter about Jerry Healy, who was an Orthodox Trotskyist group, an Orthodox Trotskyist who really was a really important pioneer of Palestine solidarity. So Trotskyism is a weird thing. It's a weird thing. It's also not a thing in the third world, right? You go to third world countries, it's not a thing. A little bit in Latin America, but not really. There's a little bit of it in Pakistan, but again, not really. Trotskyism is a first world phenomenon. It's a first world leftist phenomenon. Monty Python has jokes about them, right? You've ever watched Monty Python? There's a lot of jokes about Trotskyite groups, right? I think in what is it? The Life of Brian, which is their like spoof of the life of Jesus. They have the Judean People's Front. They're like, no, we're the People's Front of Judea. And what about the Judean People's Popular Front? And that's like making fun of Trotskyism. And especially in the 70s and 80s in Britain, there were a million of these little groups, even more than in America. There used to be a million of them in America. Now there's not so much anymore. There were a million of these little Trotskyist groups that hated each other and fought with each other. So yeah, that's Trotskyism. So I hope this was helpful. I do appreciate your contribution, Red Maze. I do appreciate it. It is appreciated. And I hope that was a helpful answer to your question. So yeah, you asked me a question. There was a lot there, but your contribution is very much appreciated. And thank you. Thank you for sending your super chat. So there you go. Didn't expect a thorough answer. Well, there you go. I can give a long answer to that. This is stuff I've studied, I'm at the point where I'm not calling myself a communist anymore. We're in a new stage called innovationism, but I've spent my whole adult life studying this. So if you got a question about communism, I can answer it. Okay. So now, we're doing Rumble rants. Lori Lamb says, whenever I tell people the USSR lost 25 to 30 million people fighting the Nazis, they are shocked and had no idea. And that is so sad.